In just 42 seconds, the mood in Washington shifted. That's how quickly billionaire CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick, dismissed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's question about undisclosed trading practices. But the real shock came right after. Crockett calmly slid a document across the table, evidence that would silence one of Wall Street's most seasoned operators and change the debate on financial transparency in America. The hearing room that morning had all the trappings of power: polished wood, the American flag standing tall, and the Great Seal of the United States presiding over a panel meant to embody accountability. At the witness table, banking executives sat in tailored suits, their collective fortunes dwarfing the GDP of many nations. But this wasn't business as usual. It was the culmination of months of inquiry into market practices that had long been hidden from public view, practices touching the lives of millions of investors without them ever realizing. At the center sat Jasmine Crockett, calm and deliberate, her notes filled not with staff-prepared soundbites but her own calculations, patterns, and citations. Facing her was Howard Lutnick, a man synonymous with Wall Street resilience. Having rebuilt Cantor Fitzgerald after losing 658 employees on September 11th, he carried himself with unshakable confidence. His testimony followed a familiar playbook: complex enough to impress, vague enough to conceal. Everyone in the room understood the script. A freshman congresswoman with 5 minutes on the clock versus a financial titan who had sparred with Congress countless times without revealing a single damaging detail. The power imbalance wasn't just obvious, it was expected. But what no one anticipated was that Crockett had been preparing for this very moment for 6 months. She had spoken with whistleblowers, sifted through thousands of trading records, and uncovered patterns of manipulation even seasoned operators couldn't completely disguise. And now, in less than a minute, the balance of power would shift. The Congresswoman would move from asking questions to presenting evidence, evidence strong enough to make even Lutnick's polished calm falter. For those watching, it wasn't just political theater. It was a rare glimpse into how financial systems really operate, and how accountability can come from the most unexpected corners. Crockett, a former criminal defense attorney with deep knowledge of finance, was uniquely equipped for this battle. She combined legal skill with an eye for the hidden mechanics of Wall Street, determined to make markets serve the public, not just insiders. Committee Chair Patrick McHenry finally announced, "Congresswoman Crockett, you now have 5 minutes." Lutnick adjusted his suit jacket, a subtle gesture of practiced confidence. Behind him, his team of attorneys and executives sat stiffly, identical blue folders in hand. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Crockett began, her voice steady, precise, and unmistakably certain. This was no longer just another hearing. It was the moment when a quiet investigation turned into a public confrontation, one that might redefine how America sees its financial markets. Do you think moments like this can truly change Wall Street? Or do the power structures always find a way to win? Mr. Lutnick, let's talk about your firm's market-making practices, specifically how you handle retail order flow and so-called price improvement. The question seemed routine, but anyone familiar with Wall Street knew its weight. Retail order flow, the system of routing everyday investors' trades through select market makers, has long been under fire. Critics argue it tilts the game against small investors, even as the industry insists it delivers better results. Howard Lutnick didn't miss a beat. "Congresswoman, we're proud of our price improvement statistics. Last year alone, Cantor Fitzgerald saved retail investors over $120 million. It was the kind of answer designed to impress. Big numbers, patriotic framing, and the promise that Wall Street was helping Main Street. But behind the smooth delivery lurked a bigger story. For months, Jasmine Crockett had been quietly working with financial mathematicians to unpack those very statistics. What they found suggested that the glowing figures might not reflect improvement at all. Crockett leaned in, her tone steady. "That's an interesting number, Mr. Lutnick. I'd like to understand how exactly your firm calculates price improvement, because my research suggests your definition doesn't match what most people would call an improvement." For the first time, a flicker crossed Lutnick's face. so subtle that only seasoned observers might have caught it. This wasn't going to be the kind of softball exchange he could glide through. He reached for the standard defense. Congresswoman, we follow industry standards. We measure the difference between the execution price and the national best bid or offer at the time the order is received. It was technically correct, and yet deeply misleading. Those standards often inflate benefits by ignoring crucial realities like market shifts during processing, or the fact that many trades might have received similar or even better pricing on open exchanges. Crockett didn't let it slide. Do those standards account for market movements during order processing, or that retail trades often qualify for midpoint pricing on public exchanges without your intervention? At that, several Cantor Fitzgerald executives shifted uneasily in their seats. This wasn't a typical round of scripted congressional theater. Crockett clearly understood the mechanics of market execution, and she was pressing on its weakest points. Lutnick tried to deflect again. Those standards have been accepted by regulators. I'm not asking about regulatory acceptance, Crockett cut in, calm but firm. I'm asking whether your methodology accounts for those specific factors that would significantly reduce your claimed improvement figures. Behind Lutnick, an attorney scribbled furiously on a yellow pad, sliding it discreetly toward him. He glanced down, then looked back up. Congresswoman, market structure is highly complex. The approach you're suggesting would be impractical at scale and doesn't reflect how markets really function. It was a practiced maneuver. Lean on complexity, imply the critic doesn't understand, and move on. But Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, with deliberate precision, she opened a folder in front of her. Mr. Lutnick, are you familiar with an internal Cantor Fitzgerald presentation dated March 17th of this year? The one titled Retail Flow Profitability Analysis, Calculation Methodologies and Marketing Strategies? The words landed like a thunderclap. Lutnick's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, eyes narrowing, posture stiffening. His legal team suddenly sat straighter, the calm mask slipping just enough to betray concern. I can't comment on internal documents without reviewing them first, he replied, his voice even, though the tension was clear. What the audience watching at home didn't yet know, but Lutnick seemed to fear, was that Crockett had her hands on a confidential presentation. In it, Cantor Fitzgerald executives openly discussed how their so-called price improvement numbers were engineered for marketing spin, not to measure real benefits for investors. Within minutes, financial bloggers live tweeting the hearing began speculating. What exactly did Crockett have in that folder? Twitter lit up like a trading floor in a panic. Market analysts who had been half listening suddenly froze, their eyes fixed on the live feed. Perhaps I can refresh your memory, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett said evenly, by quoting directly from page 17 of your firm's presentation. Your head of retail strategy writes, and I quote, "Current calculation methodology provides optimal marketing statistics while remaining technically defensible. Alternative methodologies would reduce reported improvement by 70 to 85%, but would more accurately reflect actual investor experience." The room went silent. For a few stretched seconds, even the rustling of papers and clicking of pens stopped. Committee members who had been distracted by their phones snapped to attention. Reporters rushed to alert their editors. Howard Lutnick, the man who rebuilt Cantor Fitzgerald after 9/11 and weathered the 2008 financial crisis, was suddenly cornered. Not by speculation, but by his own company's words. Lutnick's voice, steady but edged with unease, finally broke the silence. Congresswoman, I would need to see that document in context. I'd be happy to provide it, Crockett replied coolly. In fact, I'd like to submit this presentation into the official record, Mr. Chairman. As the document circulated through the committee, the hearing shifted from routine oversight into something historic. This was no longer a clash of rhetoric. This was evidence, hard proof that a Wall Street giant had internally acknowledged overstating benefits to retail investors by as much as 85%. And Crockett wasn't finished. While the committee reviews this document, Mr. Lutnick, she continued, her voice still measured, I'd like to discuss what your presentation refers to as segmentation strategies for retail order flow. To the casual viewer, it might have seemed like a change of topic, but experts watching knew better. Crockett was widening the scope of her examination. Segmentation was one of Wall Street's most closely guarded secrets, the practice of sorting customer trades into categories based on profitability. Less sophisticated traders, those with less information, were more lucrative for firms like Cantor Fitzgerald to trade against. Lutnick tried to steady the ground. Congresswoman, we process all retail orders according to our regulatory obligations. Our commitment is to provide the best possible executions, regardless of order source. But Crockett wasn't swayed. That's an interesting assertion, especially in light of Section 3 of the document I just entered into the record, titled Profitability Segmentation Framework. According to this section, Cantor Fitzgerald categorizes retail brokers into 4 tiers, based on something you call the sophistication metric. Could you explain what that measures? The precision of the question hung in the air. Those familiar with industry jargon understood immediately. The sophistication metric was a coded way of ranking traders by how informed or uninformed they were. The less informed the investor, the easier it was for firms to profit at their expense. Lutnick hesitated just a beat longer than before. Congresswoman, all market participants analyze order flow characteristics. This is standard practice to ensure we can continue providing liquidity across various market conditions. That doesn't answer my question, Mr. Lutnick, Crockett replied, her tone as calm as ever, cutting through the deflection. The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was devastatingly specific. The document laid it out in black and white. Brokers with lower sophistication metrics received 43% higher payments for order flow than their more informed counterparts, yet their customers got execution quality adjusted only to the bare minimum required by law. In plain language, the firm was squeezing maximum profit from less informed investors while giving them only the cheapest level of service that regulations allowed. Financial Twitter erupted instantly. Market experts flooded timelines with blunt translations of the jargon. Terms like adjusted execution quality and optimizing capture rates weren't technical niceties. They were code for profiting from small traders while keeping regulators just barely satisfied. Howard Lutnick tried to push back. The terminology in internal documents can be technical, he said, his trademark confidence now visibly strained. Crockett didn't hesitate. Then let me provide the context for you. She flipped to another page. Page 24 contains a profitability analysis by broker. It shows your firm delivers dramatically different execution quality to different retail brokers, not based on what's best for their customers, but on how profitable those customers are for you to trade against. The reaction was instant. C-SPAN's cameras caught committee members exchanging sharp glances, some with widened eyes. This wasn't partisan theater. It was a bipartisan realization that ordinary investors were being played. Lutnick leaned on the old defense. All executions meet regulatory requirements. But Crockett pressed harder, her voice calm but cutting. Meeting the minimum standard while systematically extracting maximum profit from less informed investors isn't the same as market fairness, Mr. Lutnick. You said in your opening statement that fairness was your priority, was it? Before he could answer, she moved on. Let's talk about Section 4, Information Leakage Mitigation Strategies. According to this section, your firm developed methods to, and I quote, monetize order flow information while maintaining technical compliance with confidentiality requirements. The room froze. Information leakage meant using knowledge of incoming trades to profit, or worse, sharing it with select clients. To regulators, that edged dangerously close to illegality. Lutnick's lawyers scribbled frantically, one leaning forward to whisper in his ear. The dynamic had flipped entirely. The Wall Street veteran was no longer in control. Crockett pressed on. On page 38, your firm describes what it calls latency-based information distribution. In simple terms, details about retail orders were made available to favored clients through timing differentials. That means information was delayed just enough to appear compliant, while still giving those clients actionable trading advantages. Financial experts watching the live stream immediately understood the implications. This was a blueprint for how Wall Street firms could handpick winners, quietly granting them an edge over ordinary investors while still skating under regulatory language. The hearing room was dead silent now. Even lawmakers who usually tuned out during financial jargon-heavy sessions were leaning forward, realizing they were witnessing something historic. Then came the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Mr. Lutnick, would you agree that providing certain clients with advantages based on knowledge of other investors' orders might constitute a form of front-running, even if structured to technically comply with regulations? The silence that followed was more powerful than any answer. When compliance turns into evasion. The brilliance of Jasmine Crockett's questioning was in its precision. She hadn't accused Howard Lutnick of breaking laws outright. Instead, she forced him to confront whether Cantor Fitzgerald's own strategies undermined the very principles those laws were meant to protect. Congresswoman, Lutnick began, then stopped. For once, the master of polished testimony hesitated, visibly weighing the dangers of every possible response. Crockett pressed forward. The specific practices are detailed in your firm's own presentation, Mr. Lutnick. A presentation that explicitly acknowledges these strategies are designed to maintain technical compliance while providing advantages the regulations were specifically created to prevent. By now, the hearing was no longer confined to the wood-paneled chamber. Social media was ablaze, hashtags trending worldwide. Financial news channels broke into regular programming to air the exchange live. Reporters in the gallery typed furiously, describing the moment as a turning point in the fight for market transparency. Crockett turned another page. On page 42, your team outlines a strategy called synthetic internalization through strategic routing. The document says, and I quote, preserves margin advantages of internalization while creating an audit trail that suggests competitive routing. The meaning was clear even to those outside finance. The firm had designed a system that looked compliant on paper while secretly preserving profits regulators had tried to curtail. Each citation was more devastating than the last. Crockett wasn't spinning or speculating. She was quoting Lutnick's own firm, word for word. The CEO shifted in his chair, casting a glance toward Committee Chair Patrick McHenry, as if searching for a lifeline. None came. Forced to respond, he leaned on a familiar line. Congresswoman, internal discussions about regulatory compliance often explore various interpretations of complex rules. That doesn't mean... Crockett cut in, her tone steady but sharper now. This document doesn't explore interpretations, Mr. Lutnick. It explicitly outlines strategies to create the appearance of compliance while deliberately subverting regulatory intent. Page 57 literally contains a section titled Regulatory Blind Spots, Opportunities and Exploitation Strategies. The room reacted audibly. Soft gasps, murmurs. Rare in such a formal setting, regulators had always assumed Wall Street might stretch the rules. But to see written proof of executives openly planning how to exploit loopholes crossed into uncharted territory. And then Crockett shifted the frame from technical jargon to moral consequence. I want to be clear. These practices don't just disadvantage some abstract group of retail investors. They harm teachers' retirement funds. They take from parents saving for their children's education. They strip wealth from ordinary Americans trying to build financial security. When your document talks about optimizing capture rates from uninformed flow, it's talking about taking money from people who don't even know this system exists. The effect was immediate. Lawmakers from both parties, many of whom had been only half engaged earlier, now leaned in. This was no longer about market mechanics. It was about constituents, neighbors, families. Lutnick, a man who had rebuilt a firm after tragedy and guided it through crisis, tried one more time to regain footing. Congresswoman, Cantor Fitzgerald has helped build liquid, efficient markets that have dramatically reduced costs for all investors compared to 20 years ago. Cherry-picking phrases from internal documents doesn't reflect the broader benefits we provide. But the balance of power in the room had already shifted. The question now was no longer whether Crockett had exposed questionable practices. It was how regulators, lawmakers, and the public would respond. Howard Lutnick reached for Wall Street's oldest shield. Talk about efficiency gains and lower costs, but avoid the uncomfortable question: who actually benefits? Jasmine Crockett didn't let him off. Her voice was calm, but her words cut deep. Mr. Lutnick, this isn't selective quoting. I'm reading directly from your own firm's strategy document. It details how Cantor Fitzgerald creates the illusion of best execution while quietly extracting profits from less informed investors. And it stands in direct opposition to the testimony you gave this committee earlier today. In that instant, the roles were reversed. The executive, once untouchable, was boxed in by his own company's words. The Congresswoman, dismissed at first as a newcomer, had come better armed than her witness. She drove the point home. The American public deserves clarity. Are our markets truly fair and transparent, or are they structured to enrich insiders while only pretending to protect ordinary investors? This document suggests the latter. And if that's the case, then our regulatory system itself demands a fundamental review. As her 5 minutes expired, the air in the room changed. There was no rustle of papers, no quick handoff to the next speaker. Lawmakers and spectators alike sat in silence, absorbing what had just been revealed. It wasn't political theater, it was something rarer, a genuine moment of accountability. The chairman finally broke the tension. We'll recess for 15 minutes. That unusual pause spoke louder than any speech. At the witness table, Lutnick and his legal team leaned in close, whispering, their faces etched with the urgency of crisis management. Outside the room, financial markets were already reacting. Shares of Cantor Fitzgerald's competitors dipped as traders worried the same practices might be widespread. Online forums lit up with talk of looming enforcement. Legal commentators scrambled to publish analyses, speculating about possible violations of securities law. When the committee reconvened, the atmosphere was transformed. Lawmakers who had planned to ask routine questions about market mechanics now drilled directly into the details of the Cantor Fitzgerald document. Even representatives known for siding with Wall Street adopted a sharper, more skeptical tone. Before questioning resumed, the chairman gave the floor back to Lutnick. The CEO leaned toward the microphone, steadier than before but missing his usual air of certainty. I want to thank Congresswoman Crockett for bringing this document forward. Having reviewed it during the recess, I can confirm it appears to be authentic. However, it was never approved at the executive level and does not represent the official policies or practices of Cantor Fitzgerald. The distancing tactic was expected, but analysts watching immediately pointed out that the cover page included senior-level contributions and sign-offs. Still, Lutnick pressed ahead. While I stand by my testimony about our commitment to strong markets, I acknowledge this presentation raises serious concerns. I've already directed our compliance department to begin a full review, and we will cooperate with any regulatory inquiries. It was carefully measured damage control. Yet the impression left on the committee and the public was unmistakable. For once, the story wasn't being told on Wall Street's terms. For the first time in years, a Wall Street executive had been forced to step back under congressional questioning. It wasn't a confession, but Howard Lutnick's acknowledgement that the explosive document was real marked an unmistakable retreat from the confident narrative he began the day with. When the committee reconvened, the atmosphere was transformed. Lawmakers who usually filled their time with broad political speeches now pressed with precise technical questions. Crockett's methodical strategy had changed the entire rhythm of the hearing. Reporters immediately recognized the shift. Bloomberg labeled the exchange a watershed moment in market structure oversight. Cable news channels broke into live coverage, abandoning other stories to track the fallout. Even social media, where financial policy rarely trends, lit up with clips of Crockett's cross-examination. Millions who had never cared about trading mechanics were suddenly debating whether the system was fair. One CNBC analyst put it plainly. This wasn't just good questioning. Crockett shattered the information imbalance that has always defined Congress's relationship with Wall Street. She knew more about Cantor Fitzgerald's practices than they expected anyone outside the firm could possibly know. That observation cut to the heart of why the moment mattered. Hearings had long been tilted in favor of seasoned executives who could control the narrative with technical jargon, but Crockett's preparation reversed the balance. For once, the questioning side had the upper hand. By the afternoon, the consequences were already cascading. The Securities and Exchange Commission issued a rare public statement, confirming it was reviewing the practices raised in the hearing. Attorneys general from 3 states quickly followed, announcing consumer protection investigations. The financial industry itself reacted just as swiftly. 2 of the largest retail brokerage firms announced they were suspending their payment for order flow arrangements pending internal reviews. A major U.S. stock exchange publicly backed new transparency rules for all trading venues, including internal systems like the one under scrutiny. These moves reflected more than corporate caution. They acknowledged that defending the status quo had suddenly become politically untenable. Once the words regulatory blind spots and exploitation strategies were read into the congressional record, even industry allies struggled to defend existing practices. By evening, governance experts were describing the hearing as a model of congressional oversight. A former SEC commissioner told CNN, "This wasn't theater. This was oversight as it should be, substantive, evidence-based, and precise." Crockett didn't come with slogans. She came with proof. Outside the chamber, a swarm of reporters surrounded the Congresswoman, demanding to know how she had obtained the internal presentation and whether she planned new legislation. Her answer was as disciplined as her questioning. Today wasn't about one company or one document, she said. It was about a bigger question. Do our markets operate with the transparency and fairness every investor deserves? Her words left little doubt. What began as a single hearing had grown into a national debate about the very foundations of market integrity. The revelations laid bare in Congress made one fact impossible to ignore. The rules meant to protect investors and the reality of how markets operated were far apart. Closing that gap, lawmakers now argued, had to start with a blunt acknowledgement of the problem, a step the hearing had forced into the open. As Jasmine Crockett left the committee room and returned to her office, the ripples of what had just taken place were spreading across Washington, Wall Street, and beyond. What had begun as another dry oversight session had turned into a rare moment of accountability, delivered not through fiery speeches, but by producing hard evidence. Within 2 days, the Securities and Exchange Commission took the unusual step of announcing the creation of a dedicated team to investigate order flow practices and execution standards. Regulators rarely move this quickly or publicly, but the pressure generated by the testimony made it unavoidable. The Department of Justice followed suit, sending document preservation notices to several major market makers, an early warning shot that prosecutors might be preparing to dig deeper. Markets responded immediately. Stocks of firms reliant on payment for order flow revenues tumbled as analysts priced in regulatory risks that only a week earlier seemed remote. Meanwhile, companies that prided themselves on transparent pricing models saw their valuations rise, with investors betting that the industry's future might finally be tilting toward openness. But perhaps the most surprising shift wasn't financial, it was cultural. Terms like order flow, price improvement, and internalization, once confined to niche financial circles, entered mainstream debate. News outlets rushed to publish explainers. Podcasts dissected the mechanics of order routing. For the first time, millions of ordinary investors wanted to understand how their trades were executed. This surge in public awareness reshaped the political landscape. Congressional offices across the country reported record levels of constituent calls about market reform. And it wasn't divided along party lines. Small investors, consumer advocates, and retirees saving for the future found themselves aligned in demanding greater fairness. The hearing quickly earned its own name on Wall Street, the Crockett hearing. Universities moved to capture its lessons. Harvard Business School prepared a case study on corporate messaging in an age of radical transparency, while Yale Law School announced a seminar on congressional oversight of complex financial systems. Corporate America also took notice. Large financial firms launched sweeping internal audits of their communications, wary of the widening gap between what they said publicly and what internal documents revealed. General counsels began issuing stricter guidelines, warning employees that the language of regulatory loopholes or compliance optics was no longer safe. Retail brokerages, under sudden scrutiny, scrambled to demonstrate accountability. Three of the biggest platforms revised how they reported execution quality, this time aligning the numbers with what investors actually experienced rather than what formulas suggested. Two went further, abandoning payment for order flow altogether in favor of a return to simple, transparent commissions. Professional investors noticed the change almost immediately. The tactics that had once depended on exploiting information asymmetries and regulatory gray zones began to lose their edge. For large institutions, trading costs ticked upward slightly. But for small retail investors, execution quality measurably improved, a quiet rebalancing of a system long tilted against them. As for Cantor Fitzgerald and its leader, Howard Lutnick, the fallout was far from simple. The firm faced regulatory heat, investor skepticism, and reputational damage that no prepared testimony could erase. The Crockett effect, as some had begun to call it, was no longer just a headline. It was a reality reshaping markets, regulation, and public trust. In the months that followed, Cantor Fitzgerald announced sweeping internal reforms. A new senior position, Chief of Market Integrity, was created to report directly to the board. Howard Lutnick remained at the helm, but his public presence shifted noticeably. Invitations to keynote financial conferences that he once routinely accepted were now politely declined. Yet the most enduring legacy wasn't inside the firm at all. It was in Congress. Crockett's method had redefined expectations for financial oversight. Committee staff described an influx of requests from lawmakers who wanted deeper technical briefings and more data-heavy preparation before hearings. C-SPAN recorded a sharp uptick in viewers tuning into financial oversight sessions, curious to see whether this new model of questioning would spread. Media outlets soon gave the approach a name: the Crockett method. Analysts broke it down into its core components: rigorous research, securing internal records instead of relying on public spin, citing specifics rather than making broad accusations, and maintaining composure while exposing contradictions step by step. Half a year later, the hearing's impact was written into law. Financial reform legislation passed with new provisions, nicknamed the Crockett Clauses by industry publications. They required standardized reporting on execution quality and explicitly outlawed practices that used loopholes to appear compliant while undermining regulatory goals. Even Lutnick himself admitted the hearing had changed the game. In an interview with the Financial Times, he reflected, "When you've been in this business long enough, you think you know how oversight will play out. Congresswoman Crockett upended those expectations by being sharper, more precise, and more prepared than what we normally face. That's forced us to rethink how we approach hearings." The ripple effect spread quickly. Corporate legal teams began combing through internal presentations, anticipating that what once stayed hidden could now surface in the public record. Executives preparing for testimony spent more time aligning their talking points with internal realities, aware that inconsistencies were no longer safe. Academics studying the hearing pointed out that Crockett hadn't changed the rules themselves. She had changed how those rules were enforced, shifting the risk calculation around regulatory arbitrage. For ordinary investors, the shift was harder to see but no less real. Execution quality quietly improved, hidden costs declined, and trading practices began to align more closely with the ideals of fairness advertised in glossy brochures. A year later, in her district office, Crockett's focus hadn't wavered. When asked about her new reputation as a watchdog of Wall Street, she redirected the credit away from herself. "That day wasn't about me or even about one company," she explained. "It was about holding powerful institutions accountable to their own promises. The gap between how markets are described and how they actually work is still too wide. Closing it takes consistent effort, not just one viral moment." That mindset captured why the Crockett effect endured. It showed that accountability didn't require demonizing markets themselves, but rather insisting that their stated values, fairness, transparency, and opportunity, be more than words. For millions of Americans who had long believed the financial system was rigged in favor of insiders, the hearing proved something different. That preparation, persistence, and precision could tilt the balance, even if only slightly, back toward ordinary participants. It was evidence that entrenched power can be challenged, that opacity can be pierced, and that institutions that once seemed unaccountable can, with the right approach, be forced to answer to the people they serve. In the wake of the hearing, Cantor Fitzgerald scrambled to show it had heard the message. The company unveiled sweeping compliance reforms and created a new senior role, Chief of Market Integrity, who would report directly to the board. Howard Lutnick kept his position, but the change in posture was unmistakable. The once highly visible CEO pulled back from the spotlight, skipping major financial conferences where he had long been a regular voice. But the real legacy was bigger than any one firm. Crockett's approach had changed how Washington and the public viewed congressional oversight. Staffers described an unexpected surge of requests from lawmakers who now wanted highly technical briefings before hearings. C-SPAN reported viewership spikes for oversight sessions that had once drawn a little interest, as audiences tuned in hoping for more exchanges of substance instead of routine political theater. Media commentators quickly identified the pillars of what became known as the Crockett method: meticulous preparation, use of internal evidence rather than sound bites, exact citations instead of broad accusations, and a steady demeanor while exposing contradictions step by step. 6 months later, those methods reshaped the law itself. Congress passed financial reform measures with what the industry dubbed the Crockett provisions: mandates for standardized reporting on trade execution quality, and explicit bans on practices that gave the appearance of compliance, while undermining the spirit of regulation. Even Lutnick himself acknowledged the shift. Speaking to the Financial Times, he reflected, "After decades in this industry, you start to expect oversight to follow a familiar script." Congresswoman Crockett changed that by coming better prepared and more precise than anyone anticipated. It's altered how we approach these interactions going forward. That change spread far beyond Cantor Fitzgerald. Corporate testimony prep across Wall Street began to include deep reviews of internal memos and presentations, documents once considered safe from outside eyes. The information imbalance that had long allowed executives to dominate oversight hearings narrowed, if only slightly. Scholars studying the phenomenon noted that the hearing didn't rewrite the rules of finance. It rewrote how they were enforced. By proving that hidden practices could be dragged into the public record, Crockett had raised the risks of regulatory arbitrage across the financial system. For the average investor, the technical details were invisible. Teachers, firefighters, small business owners saving for retirement didn't need to follow the jargon. But they felt the impact: clearer trade execution, fewer hidden costs, and a market that, for once, behaved a little closer to its advertised principles of fairness and transparency. A year later, in her district office, Crockett was asked by a local journalist about her reputation as Wall Street's watchdog. She brushed aside the title. "That day wasn't about one company or one file," she explained. "It was about whether we're willing to demand that powerful institutions live up to the standards they themselves claim to uphold. The distance between how markets are sold to the public and how they actually work is still too wide. Closing it takes more than a viral moment. It takes sustained effort." That perspective defined the Crockett effect: accountability rooted not in attacks on markets as a concept, but in insisting that their promises of fairness and transparency actually mean something for millions of ordinary Americans. The hearing proved that entrenched systems are not untouchable. With preparation, precision, and persistence, even the most complex financial machinery can be open to scrutiny. And when it is, the balance of power, long tilted toward insiders, can, at least in part, be shifted back toward the people who depend on those markets every day.